Okay, so we are going to have a couple of targets today. Our first target is going to be understanding the Dutch art market during the Baroque period. So when we talk about the Dutch, we're talking about Holland. So we're going to be talking about Northern Europe. So you can kind of understand based on things that we've learned before that there's going to be a lot of Northern Renaissance characteristics, a lot of attention to detail using oil paint. So we call this often the golden age of Dutch painting. And so in Northern Netherlands, the Protestant Republic had been created during this time. It gained independence in 1648 from Catholic Spain. Flanders, right? Flanders, that section kind of south, west of Holland, remains Catholic and under Catholic rule by the Habsburgs in Spain. Holland becomes independent and it becomes a major commerce power. So a lot of the Dutch were into banking and trade. And so this is the time of a lot of colonization. So we know the Dutch were sailing the oceans, right, to distant lands. They were trading spices, they were trading objects and things and materials. And so they gained a lot of wealth and a lot of power during this time. And so artists, some artists would work for the Spanish, would work for the Catholic Church, and would do religious pieces. But for the most part, the artists of the North, right, being that they are Protestant, had to find new subject matter and new clientele because they didn't have the church, they didn't have the monarchy, they didn't necessarily have the uber elite like in Florence and Rome, these families who are basically kings in a small town, or I should say a big city, right? And so they had scenes of everyday life, which we call genre scenes. Hunters in the Snow would be also a characteristic, or would be considered a genre scene. It's a scene of everyday life, landscapes, still lifes, portraits. So there becomes a very enormous market for portraits. And Rembrandt, right? Remember Rembrandt, the guy who drew his wife and himself in that intaglio print that we saw yesterday? He was a very important portrait painter, as well as printmaker in the North. So who is the Dutch art market? If we don't have the monarchy and we don't have the Catholic Church, who's going to buy paintings? What do you think? Who's going to buy a painting? Any educated guesses? Kwana, what do you think?
This is a really simple answer, but just like the upper class.
I could barely hear you. I wonder why. Could you say it again?
Could an answer just be like the upper class?
It could be yes, upper class is true. It also is going to be the growing middle class, believe it or not. So it's going to be the middle and upper class. So who would those people be? That would be the merchant class. That would be people who own businesses, who sell commodities. It could be individual people, so individual patrons, individual families, but also groups. There were groups like fraternities, like orders, like the Moose or the Kiwanis, or these organizations of men who would also have group paintings made of themselves. And so they would actually have these things made for their own ownership, as well as be placed in like their meeting hall. So everyone knew who was a member of the society, because this all predates photography, right? So knowing that these works are for private ownership, notice how small, right, most of these pieces are, okay? So most of everything except for group portraits are gonna be pretty small, right? So thinking about consider the knot small, right? So this is Rembrandt, right? This is Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, you know, he was a prolific printmaker. We saw that yesterday, and we saw a lot of his portraits yesterday as well. But this is a group portrait that he's pretty well known for. And so do you know who this is an image of? Can you tell what they must be, like with their profession?
Doctors.
They're doctors, very good. So this was made for a medical school, right? So this is a larger piece. Normally these group portraits were larger, right? So he's basically showing, this doctor who wrote this really famous book is basically showing how tendons work. So he's got a corpse, right? He's got a body, and he's pulling on a tendon to show how the fingers wiggle, right? But if I go back to the work, it's very much Baroque, right? Do you think it's the style of Caravaggio or the style of Carracci? What do you think? Is it a fancy ceiling painting, or is it dramatic oil painting? Brianna, what do you think?
Oil painting.
Yes, is it Caravaggio or Carracci in style?
Carracci.
Carracci is the guy who does those ceilings, right? So like the Gaudi ceiling that we have at El Jesus, those are those illusionistic ceilings, the Carracci ones. The dramatic lighting, right, where it's really, really dark and there's a spotlight shining, is inspired by Caravaggio. And you'll see that most of the artists in the North are much more inspired by him than they are by Carracci. Because Carracci is a little bit more old school. You know, it's just a continuation of, it's just really a continuation of the style of the Renaissance. And so normally when we think of Baroque, we think about these really dark paintings. This one is of a fraternity getting ready for a parade. Rembrandt actually fell out of favor after painting this one called The Night Watch. Does anyone know why he might have fallen out of favor? Why groups might not want him painting their portraits anymore? Would you be upset if you were this guy right here? Can you see me circling his head? If you paid, you know, money to have a portrait made, would you be pleased with how you look right here? No, right? All of these people would have paid probably an equal sum to have a group painting made. And some of them are in shadow. Some of them are blocked where, you know, someone's covering their head. Some of them are cut off by the edge. And so after this portrait, Rembrandt basically had a hard time getting commissions. There's this great flash mob right here that you can click on later if you want to watch how somebody did a flash mob based on this. But since it's not in the 250 and we've got a lot to get through today, I'm going to skip it, right? So notice how his style is very different than the typical. So when we look at these group portraits, the image on the top left is what most group portraits look like during this day, okay? And so there are certain artists like Rembrandt who are, you know, a little bit better known, but we kind of understand their genius a little bit, right? And how he was really composing the space and creating a story rather than just documenting what people look like, right? So this one is Franz Hal, and you might recognize this one if you ever look at your textbook. This is the cover of your textbook. And so he's really known for portraits. And so I just wanted to show you a few of them. He's not really in the 250, but he would have been a Dutch portrait painter who would have done like well-known people. So this is a musician that was well-known in the area, right? This is called the Laughing Cavalier is this one. This is another cavalier. But he often captured people in like a moment where they almost feel like they're in action. So like notice his hand is like waving. Once again, before photography, but it has kind of a snapshot kind of quality to it. He uses a lot of expressive brushstroke with dramatic Caravaggio lighting, right? So he's known for these vignettas, which are these fleeting moments of time, kind of capturing a single moment. Vermeer, who we have in the 250, does the same thing, right? This is Judith Leister. She's a female painter who was known for paintings of musicians. And so this is a self-portrait of her with the kind of imagery that she painted. Some of her, like, you know, famous pieces today are images of kind of like the female point of view. So when we think about like the Artemisia Gentileschi's version of Judith and the Holofernes, you know, here this creepy guy is kind of bothering in her bar. This is a Judith Leister. This one where a woman is enjoying the attention by the creepy old men was made by a man, right? This is probably the most famous Judith Leister. Maybe you've seen this. And so here we have this little fifer playing a flute, and you really get a sense of how they use Caravaggio lighting. We got this direct, like the spotlight shining through on the left side to illuminate his concentration of him playing that flute, right? So this would have been a small little portrait of this boy, which, you know, a baker or a banker or a hat salesman or a musician, like you go to a musical shop, this might be on the wall of the shop. So these are these new patrons, okay? So the next person that we have is in the 250, and this is Jan Vermeer. Jan Vermeer. And what I want to do is show you a bunch of pieces by him and to see if you can tell his style, okay? We'll skip that question. We'll go to the genre in a second. So what are some of the similarities that we see in these works? Who's the subject matter in these works? Who's the subject matters? Raheel, can you help me out?
I would say mostly women.
Right. And so Vermeer worked in a studio in his house, and he used a lot of the same props. So in his studio, he had a window on the left, right? And then often he used a lot of the same props over and over again. And so what he would do is kind of create these quiet moments of women in everyday scenes. So this is a genre scene. It's a scene from everyday life. So sometimes they are servants pouring milk, right? And he has a real attention to detail in his paintings. So notice the little white highlights on the glass and the texture on the bread, very characteristic of the stuff that we've seen in the North, right? Quiet moments. Here, a woman of the house. So this would not be a servant. This would be the woman of the house. I can tell because of the clothing she's wearing, right? Her clothing is much nicer. She's wearing silks. She's wearing layers to keep herself warm. And here is kind of like a quiet moment. There's often a sense of like voyeurism in a Vermeer. It's like you're looking in through a window into someone's quiet world. And so this is a good example of it because this one literally shows the door frame into that studio, right? And so here we have a woman and her servant receiving a letter. He used underpainting for these. So like Leonardo, he would paint in monochrome, often using browns like burnt umbers, and then he would lay the color on top of it in glazes to create his colors, right? He often is what we consider a master of lighting. There's a lot of use of the light coming in to illuminate it. It's very soft, but notice the reflection of the girl in the window, right? So he has a big attention to detail. And one of the reasons for that is that he was one of the first artists to use, well, not, I shouldn't say one of the first, but he used some scientific tools in order to see images. And so he used a camera obscura. Now, camera obscura is not your typical camera where it can capture a picture permanently. But what it basically is it's a dark box with an opening and a mirror. And so when he looked inside of it, he could actually see the painting, and he would use it to create some of the effects. So an example would be like Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is one of his more famous pieces. It's not, when we look at it, we think of it as being pretty realistic, but it really has like some of the bare essence. Her skin is very smooth, but her lips have individual brushstrokes for those glares. It's not like it's perfectly modeled and perfectly smooth. There's little dabs of color, and people think that that's because the camera obscura wasn't quite clear. Like they would have had more rudimentary lenses back then, and so it wasn't necessarily as crisp. And so like thinking about the fabric here, we get the idea that it's fabric, but it's not perfectly modeled. It's not perfectly smooth, right? And so thinking he probably used that camera obscura. So here is the image that we have in the 250 called Woman Holding a Balance, right? So this is an example of two different vocabulary terms that we want to make sure that we get. In most general speaking, this is a genre scene. This is a scene of everyday life. So this is not necessarily a portrait, okay? A portrait would be, oh, this is a portrait of Alana, or this is a portrait of Jeff. This is a little bit more based on kind of the content and the symbolism that is included in the painting, as well as the environment. So the title tells us what it is, right? It is a woman holding a balance, right? That is what this scene is about. It's not, you know, Doris holding a balance. It's just a generic woman, right? And it is a vignetta, which is a fleeting moment of time. So it has kind of a snapshot quality to it, where we feel like we're capturing a specific moment of time. Okay, so when we look at this painting, I don't think we're going to watch the video on this one. I think instead we'll just kind of diagnose it, but we'll watch some of the videos on some of the pieces that are a little bit more difficult. So let's focus on what the mood is, right? So what would you say the mood of this painting is? Is it like anxious? Is it agitated? Is it happy? Is it calm? Is it soothing? Is it, I guess I said calm and soothing, there's kind of the same things. Is it active? Is it passive? What do you think? Isabella, what do you think?
It looks kind of passive. It looks like she's waiting for the balance to settle.
Right. This is a very quiet moment, right? It's a very calm moment. You're right. She's waiting for that balance to settle, right? And so how is that effect created, right? We've been looking at works of the Baroque, right? And they typically have really dramatic lighting. Does this have the same sort of spotlight quality that we normally associate with the Baroque? Not really. So instead of being a light that we can't see that's really bright and dramatic, here we have natural lighting coming in from that window on the left, right? It's coming from a window, right? And it settles on her face and it settles on her hand, holding the balance, and illuminates just what's important to the scene, right? So there is darkness, there is chiaroscuro, difference between light and dark, but it's just not as bright and dramatic as we see typically in the Baroque. So we can see how Vermeer is using that lighting to communicate meaning, right? So who is she? Do we think she's a servant, or is she the woman of the house? How can we tell?
She's probably a woman of the house because she's like handling jewelry and
right.
wearing
Exactly. She's got, like, you wouldn't let the servants have all the jewels. They might be putting things away, but you would like double check that things were like okay, right? And so this woman is wearing furs, and she's wearing silks, and she's wearing layers to keep herself warm. She's wearing a hood, right? Because it was cold there. And so this is an affluent woman of the house. Like Varun was saying, she's got all these jewelry around her. So what's the meaning there, right? So like I said, this is a genre scene. Vermeer was one of the very few Catholics working in this area. And he actually, it kind of made things difficult to be an artist because not all of his patrons, liked his Catholicism. And so the funny thing is there is an element of his religion in this painting. Does anyone see it? If you look in the background, there is a painting there of religious significance. So he's got this painting of the Last Judgment, where we have the blessed and the damned, right? But this also has some symbolic imagery that could be viewed as Catholic or Protestant, right? And so we have this idea of balance of good and bad deeds, right? So the balance can be symbolic, and it can be the balance of earthly goods, right? Those earthly riches, and your salvation or doing good deeds, right? So knowing what's most important in life. So just like we've seen in the North before, there's often a lot of disguised symbolism, right? I think we already covered those things, right? So when you are looking at a work by Vermeer, he doesn't make that many. I think if I remember right, there's like 13 Vermeers. He died kind of as a relatively young age. But most of his paintings have a lot of similarities to them. They typically have a window as a light source, right? So we have it here on the left side, and we saw that over and over again in those other images. His images are highly composed. He would organize, right, these materials, these things in his studio and paint them. He typically uses linear perspective. This one has linear perspective that goes directly behind the scales, so that really focuses the attention on the scales. He often has a balance between what's going on the left and what's going on the right. And it's often of women in a very private moment. Remember, kind of capturing a calm moment of time. Okay. Any questions on Vermeer? Okay, so I just wanted to show you some others really fast. Landscapes were popular as well. This is a Vermeer. This is the only one in the textbook, which is funny because he was really known for his genre scenes. But here is a painting of Utrecht, where he lived. But probably the most famous landscape artist of the day was Jacob Rudal. And so he would do scenes. Here's like a ruins of a Gothic church, kind of in this like stormy sky. Right? He was known for his big skies. So notice how low the horizon is, right? And how big the sky is in each of his scenes, right? So he was painting scenes of Holland, so windmills, things like that, right? So those big flat fields and big skies, right? This is, I can't remember his name, but interiors and architectures were popular as well. So this is inside a church, right, that had been whitewashed, right? And then another subject matter is this one. What would you say the subject matter of this is? What kind of, not genre, but what kind of category would we say this is? Any ideas?
Still life.
This is still life, very good. And so really common in the North was still lifes based on what we call breakfast scenes. And so they would often be scenes of food that you might eat at breakfast. And the funny thing is that often these scenes tell stories, which are really kind of fascinating. I think that most people just kind of look at it and go, wow, look at all that fancy stuff. So, what is the class of these people who are having these still life paintings made? They're probably affluent because they've got things like silver and fancy food like nuts and citrus and so on. And so you can see the attention of detail to get that right texture and glare and detail. So still that connection with detail through oil paint. Here's a typical genre painting. What happened during breakfast? How is this Baroque? How would you say this is Baroque? Eva, can you help me?
Maybe like the dark shadows and the lighting.
Right, so it's got dramatic lighting, and it also feels like something bad happened. Does anyone see what I mean by that? Why would I say something bad might have happened? What's the visual evidence?
The glass on the left is broken.
Right, it's been knocked over, it's been broken. You can see a little shard taken out over here. It's like, what happened at breakfast? Did someone come in and rob them? Did someone get taken away? Was there a fight in the family? But really, these scenes were more about showing off the wealth of the family. And so there's like little intricate details, things like lemons and oranges and citrus and things like that. You know, it'd be hard to get in Holland. It doesn't grow naturally there. So they would have had to get it traded up north. And so those were, you know, really expensive sort of things. And so these breakfast paintings became ways for Protestants to show off their wealth. It wasn't something that they were supposed to do. They were supposed to be much more humble. And so this is kind of their sly way of showing off their wealth. Okay, so the image that we have in our 250 is by Rachel Roush, and so this is called Fruits and Insects. So this is not quite your stereotypical breakfast page. This is more just a still life. So we're going to go ahead and look at the video for this, and as I'm queuing up the video, let's focus on how her still life is more than just an object painting, right? What's the meaning, right? So what's the subject matter and what's the meaning?
We're in the Uffizi, and we're looking at a still life painting by a Dutch artist whose name is Rachel Roush.
Roush was incredibly successful during her very long career. She painted from the time she was in her teens until she was in her 80s.
More than 60 years. And you can see why her paintings were so wildly popular. In fact, her paintings regularly sold for double what Rembrandt's paintings sold for.
In Holland, artists specialized in certain types of paintings. Artists like Rembrandt painted portraits. Others like Rachel Roush painted still life paintings. Others like Ruysdael painted landscapes. They were painting for a widening merchant class in 17th century Holland.
She specialized in flowers, but this particular painting is fruit and insects.
And it seems to be about the autumn, the subject of the harvest, fruits and vegetables that are harvested in the autumn. Corn, we have squash,
Chestnuts and grapes, but also wheat. And this reminds us that still lifes were often not only simple representations of items that might be put on a table, but would have symbolic value.
Any Christian looking at this painting in the 17th century would have seen the wheat and the grapes and thought of the Eucharist, of the sacrament of communion, of the body and blood of Christ.
The bread and the wine.
And it's also important to realize that this is not just a scene that she would have assembled on the table and painted. This is likely a composite of studies of grapes, studies of peaches, studies of plums, studies of a nest with eggs in it, studies of a butterfly that are then combined imaginatively beautifully into this composition.
Into a microcosm. This was a time in the late 17th and early 18th century when the microscope was perfected and we were looking into worlds beyond what we had known before.
And a scientific interest in categorizing the natural world and looking closely at it. And in fact, a great example of this is Rachel's own father, Friedrich Voisch.
He was one of the most famous scientists of his day. He specialized in botany and the study of anatomy, especially human anatomy.
And he was an artist. He had a cabinet of curiosities, a collection of natural wonders that he published and illustrated himself.
Rachel's mother, on the other hand, was the daughter of one of the most famous architects in the Netherlands at this time. Perfect preparation for a woman who would spend her long life looking at infinitely small details of the natural world,
And painting these things as though they were almost scientific specimens.
but bringing them together in beautiful compositions.
What I notice are the color harmonies. So we have these reds and greens. Red and green are complementary colors. The green grapes on one side, the red on the other, balanced by the red plums on the other side of the composition.
You can see that also within individual elements. Look, for instance, at the bunch of grapes on the right side, those red purple grapes, except that they have a little bit of a dust of powder blue. And we see the same thing in the plum on the extreme left.
The butterfly in the foreground, maybe it's a moth, that's just landing is a good reminder that Rachel's father, Friedrich, collected specimens like butterflies and preserved them, and in fact was a master at preserving parts of human anatomy and animal and insect species, and had such a famous collection that he sold it to Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia.
I love that butterfly. It looks as if it is just about to land, but perhaps having second thoughts because it's a salamander, a small lizard.
That idea that you mentioned before of a world of its own.
This is a painting that is about slow, careful discovery, and this is an artist whose mastery rewards the patient observer.
So how is it more than just a still life painting? How is it more than just a typical still life painting? Emily, what do you think?
Well, this one kind of, I think the video was like, it said it was telling like about the fall, like the harvest, and also like looking at the grapes and like the wheat. It was like the Eucharist.
So there is a lot of symbolism in it. So there's objects from the harvest, right? There's also religious imagery, right, with bread and wine symbolizing the Eucharist, which of course Protestants and Catholics would have participated in, right? And knowing that her father, right, was into scientific investigation, she too was interested in this. So it's a collection of different things focusing on the kind of individual details of those objects. And so thinking about the basic characteristics of the Baroque, how is this still life Baroque? What Baroque characteristics would you say there is? Cora, can you give me one?
It's very dramatic.
How so? How is it dramatic?
Like the lighting, it's very dark in the background, like a spotlight in the foreground.
Right. And I would dare say that even the placement of the objects is dramatic too. Because a lot of times when we think about, like, if we think about people, right, we have people in a scene and they're posed like a Caravaggio or a Gentileschi, they can be like, you know, positioned and angled in a way that's very dramatic. This is not a super organized still life where everything is like stale and precise and symmetrical. There's like this haphazardness to it, but we know that she carefully planned how to place each and every one of these objects, right? So there's a sense of chaos in the organization, but also a sense of order. So there's that sense of like balance there, right? So we've got the rich colors, we've got the symbolic meaning, we've got the heightened interest with that dramatic lighting, right? Here's a very famous painting of hers of about flowers, she was probably the best known for her flower paintings. This one has all kinds of flowers from all different seasons. So unlike the other one, which is just the harvest, this one has all the seasons. And it also has different seasons of life of a flower. It's got buds and blossoms that are open, and then ones that are dying because they're drooping. So, once again, kind of the life cycle. So her paintings are often more than just what meets the eye. Okay, so that ends our discussion on Holland. Okay, so for Holland, we've got Rembrandt, we've got Vermeer, and we've got Ruysch. Okay, we're going to move to France. We're going to look at the images associated with Louis XIV. So this is not in the 250, but I think it's really important that we look at this painting to be able to understand how powerful Louis XIV was. How is power conveyed in this painting? Isabel, what do you think? How is power conveyed?
His clothes.
How would you describe those clothes?
Very opulent.
Yeah, so he's got silk with fleur-de-lis all over it, and then he's got fur on the flip side in places, right? And it's like bundles and bundles of fabric, right? Is there anything else about this that shows power besides his clothing? Do you guys remember the Near East? What we talked about images of power. What are the power characteristics? Remember, one of them was funny hair, right? Doesn't he kind of have funny hair? Here he's got a wig to make himself look younger. It's not a white wig, which you normally associate with, the French, like a white powdered wig, but here he's got one to make him look a little bit younger. And then he's also holding a staff. You guys see that? He's kind of leaning across it. What the heck is happening with his legs? Does anyone know the story about Louis XIV and his legs? He was a rather short man, and so he often wore high heels. And notice that his heels are in red. He used, like, red was his color. So when you go to Versailles, there's a lot of red. But with that high heels, he would wear them to show off his legs. So often his clothing was designed to show off his legs, which he considered to be his best characteristic, his best physical characteristic, right? So here we have him in his coronation robes. It's lined in fur with those fleur-de-lis. He's got idealized legs and wigs. He looks directly at the viewer. He's life-size. Not that you could have being able to tell by this painting, but he is life-size. He looks down at us, right? He's got a sword, he's got a scepter, and behind him, we have classical architecture, which really helps us understand what French classicism is all about. Here's the different ways that the French and the English portrayed their king in the same time period. So this is Charles over here, and he's like a country dandy, right? He looks like a farmer or a hunter, right? And here is Louis XIV, right? So, what is the function of Versailles? Does anyone know what the function of Versailles is? What was it used for? Versailles. Alana, do you know?
I think in the Smart History essay, they said it was to emphasize Louis' importance.
Yes, but let's say in a more basic place, more basic setting, what was it used for?
Maybe to bring in officials to meet with the king.
Right. This would have been his residence, even more generic than that. But it definitely was a place he met with people. Okay. So the French monarchy had a palace in Paris, and it was the Louvre. So the very famous museum that we know, right, was the French royal palace. And Louis XIV decided that Paris was full of gossips, and it was a place that You know, he wanted to make sure that all the attention was on him. So he had Versailles built in the countryside. I think it's like maybe 12 to 15 miles away from Paris. Don't quote me on that, but it's on the outskirts of Paris. And so he had this very modest, not modest at all, country retreat made, right? And not only is it a household for himself, but he brought his court with him. So his court was kind of locked up in here as well. One of the comparisons that AP likes to do with this is the Forbidden City, the Chinese Forbidden City, right? It's this idea that it is a place where the king lived and the court officials went to pay homage to him. And Louis XIV was so important that we consider the style of French Baroque to be the style of Louis XIV, right? And this image that we have on the right called the Hall of Mirrors, we'll talk about how that really shows off the power and wealth of Louis, right? So how does the estate command power? How does it command power?
Well, I'd say that they altered the terrain of the land just for their building.
Right.
So they have it spread over multiple acres.
Right. There was like 20,000 some people who lived at Versailles. It was Louis and his family, the court, servants, right? They had a zoo there with exotic animals. People who, you know, provided the agriculture for the area lived within the walls there too. And so Versailles, right, is this symmetrical building, right? And it's kind of viewed as like the center of the world. And it faces towards Paris, so that Paris knew that Louis was in command from his countryside retreat, right? And there's these large avenues that lead out to the city, right? So how he orientated it and how it is like, you know, facing the city really does command his power. And all of this stuff that we have on the outside are his gardens. He had two different styles of gardens. He had these well manicured gardens, right, that we see here. And then he had more rural gardens on the outside, kind of like what we consider to be like an English garden. And that's places where him and his court could go on like fox hunts and things like that, right? So this is the image of the Palace of Versailles, or one of them that you guys have. And the architect of this is Louis Lavaux and Jules Hardin Mansour. And so we're going to look at how this is what we consider to be Baroque classicism. So the style of Louis XIV is often called Baroque classicism. So I added here an image of the Parthenon to kind of help you out. How would you say this is classical? What are some of the classical tendencies of this section of Versailles?
It has some of the pillars on the
Right.
front of the building.
Right. So it has columns, right? It's got capitals on top of those columns. Anything else?
The building is very rectangular and symmetrical.
Right. It's symmetrical, right? So there's a center and there's equal parts on each side. So it has that symmetry that Jasmine mentioned. It has a faux podium. So notice how it looks like it's elevated. The first story kind of looks like it's elevated. It's a very sort of simple facade. And then the second story is much more decorative, right? It's got arched windows. It's got columns and pilasters, and it has architectural reliefs and sculptures on the roof, right? So the French modeled their style of architecture after ancient Greek and Rome, right? So we have this marble courtyard that's included in your image set. And when you look at this architecture, what makes it Baroque, right? It's got classical tendencies. It's what I would dare say, maybe not super dramatic, but it's definitely ornate, right? There's a lot of gold leaf. There's a lot of different colors of marble. There's a lot of sculptures. You know, it's kind of like that multimedia extravaganza that we talked about in Rome, right? Think about Bernini. It's a combination of all these architectural and painting and sculptural elements here. Now, this marble courtyard was connected to his bedroom, and this is in the very center of the palace. So his bedroom is in the middle of the palace, right? And that's to symbolize that he is the center of the world, right? So he's the center of the world. So he rises, right? And his bedroom, the court would watch him wake up in the morning. So this is his bedroom. You can see how he had these heavy curtains kind of closed around his bed, but then they would open it up, servants would open it up so people could watch him. And that's why there's a fence there. That's not a modern added fence. There was a fence there so the court could watch him wake up. In the queen's chambers, she had to publicly give birth because, of course, that would be a future monarch, right? And so that's all hidden behind that image that is in our 250, right? So then this is, I think, the last image that we have at Versailles. This is called the Hall of Mirrors. And so Charles Le Brun did a lot of the interior architecture and decoration of this. So this is not a room. I want to make sure that we get that. This is not a room. This is a hall. So can you imagine what the rest of the palace must look like, right? If this is just a hall. This is just a room, a hall that connects to bigger rooms, right? So in this hall, the ceilings are painted with scenes, and Louis is depicted as a god. I'll show you a close-up of that. The architecture is covered in gold leaf, and there is gold leaf on furniture, and there's gold sculptures and objects. So like, candlesticks, things like that. Because gold, right, complements the red, but also is kind of like the color of opulence, right? It has large chandeliers made from fine crystal, right? And you can see that dangling off the ceiling all the way down, right? And then on the outside of the building, there's these enormous windows to see the views of that manicured gardens. On the opposite side, there's mirrors that echo the shape of the windows. So these over here are gigantic sections of mirror. And you can see that they're kind of put together like a stained glass window with their big panes. Mirrors would have been extremely expensive, right? Because most people had a small mirror, right? So he has these big mirrors added into the interior. And so what that does is it makes the space feel even bigger, and it echoes the exterior. So you can see reflections of the gardens in the mirrors, and you can see reflections of the opulence of the interior in the mirrors. So here we have another view of those ceilings. So even the ceilings are painted kind of like some of those Roman ceilings that we saw, kind of segmented by architecture and then kind of individual paintings included, right? So they use things like grisaille, right? Of course, this is coming from like Michelangelo, but the lighting on these ceiling paintings are a little bit more dramatic. They're not quite the light and bright that we see. Here we have Louis XIV as a god, right? Right? And so the functions of the gardens were not just places for you to go for a walk. They were places for Louis to be seen. Louis would go and hold court, and people would, watch him talk, or watch him watch a waterfall, or watch a water feature. Like, it was all about showcasing him. And so they were like little stages. And so there's a series of these gardens done by a garden architect named André Lenotre, right? And so there's these large water features with classical inspired sculptures around them. And then here is the gardens that we have. Excuse me, I forgot we had one more. This is the orangery. So this video, I'm not quite sure if it's going to get blocked as copyright, but you can watch this video if it works. Oh, maybe it doesn't work anymore. But it basically goes through the different gardens at Versailles, knowing that those gardens changed over the different kings. So there was ones that kept, getting added and upon. So like Marie Antoinette had a garden created and a household created kind of on the outskirts, right? And so it was really common to have these classical sculptures around. This is in a grotto where Louis XIV is shown as a Greek god, right? So remember, once again, that the gardens are places for Louis to be seen, right? This is one of the more formal gardens. So formal gardens are typically symmetrical, organized, manicured, and then like an English garden is more natural, right? So here you can see how perfect and how the environment is structured, like we said at the beginning, right? This is some French painting from the day. This is Lorraine. He did a lot of scenes of like Mary and Mary Magdalene, and they have like Caravaggio lighting to them. Linane did a lot of scenes of like peasants, so like happy peasants of the day, right? And then probably the most famous painter was Jacques-Louis David, who was a French painter, but he primarily worked out of Rome. And his style is the style that we'll see after we get done with the Americas and Africa. His style is basically what becomes neoclassical and romanticism, right? Where the drama becomes a little bit more artificial and not as dramatic as the Baroque, right? But he did a lot of classically inspired paintings. So classical subject matter, classical architecture, inclusion of nature, right? And so when we move into neoclassicism, romanticism, we'll talk about how we have like two factions of artists developing. Some of them are followers of Poussin, who are much more not David, excuse me, I misspoke. This is Poussin. David paints in the style of him, which will have David in the 250. But they're very conservative paintings. This is like the painting of the Academy. And then the other people are people who are inspired by Rubens. And so that will be more romanticism. This is more neoclassicism. But it'll make sense later, okay? So the last section that we have is we're going to go back to the Americas, and we will be going back to the Americas on Thursdays too. So after our quiz, we will move on to Mesoamerican art, right? So the first piece we have is called the front piece of the Codex Mendoza. Does anyone see any recognizable imagery on this that they maybe know who the story is about? Anything on this look familiar to you? How about now? Right? This is the story of the founding of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City. So this is Mexico City. This is a story of the Aztecs. And so the Aztecs were a people who were roaming around central Mexico, and it was so that they would see a vision. And in that vision, they saw a hawk grasping a serpent on top of a cactus. And so once they saw that, they knew that that was where they needed to build their capital city, but also like the center of their religion. And so we have in that center there an image that's very similar to the Mexican flag, right? So does anyone know who this was made for? Do you think this is made for the Aztecs or the Spanish? What do you think? This was made for the Viceroy. So this was made for Don Antonio de Mendoza, hence the name, who was the viceroy. So he was sent from Spain to act as the king. It was supposed to be sent back to Spain, but it never made it, right? And the function of this is it describes the founding of Tenochtitlan. It shows the power of the Aztecs, which then implies the power of the Spanish, because the Aztecs were extremely powerful. So in order for them to be conquered by the Spanish, that would then prove the power of Spain. That makes sense? Right? Instead of showing your opponent as weak, you show your opponent as strong so that you look stronger. Right? So this is a whole book. A codex is a book. And so it describes the 196 years of the Aztec rule. It has 3 sections. The first one talks about the conquering of other city-states in the region. It shows the conquering of alliance and tributes paid. So basically, it has records of things that were given to the Aztecs in payment. And then it has punishments and requirements for citizenships. So, it tells the laws, it tells a lot of history of the Aztecs, right? And so we mentioned this about power already, but this image is based on the shape of Tenochtitlan. So Mexico City is basically a city built with a lake around it. And then these are all volcanoes around it, right? And so the city by the Aztecs was divided into 4. And so that's what the cross section is there. And it shows how it is divided into 4. And in the very center of it is where Temple Mayor was. So their main temple, their main religious center was viewed as the center of the universe. And it was the center of their lands as well. And so around this image, there are other things that are recognizable. We have temples. The Aztecs as well as Mayans would often have these racks of skulls. So when they sacrificed people, they would put the skulls on display. And then we have warriors conquering at the bottom, and we have priests sitting around what would be like the temple in the very center. Right? So if you were going to describe the style, right, this one is very, very flat and very, very formal, right? It's kind of like Egyptian-like. So things are in profile. It's all about getting the most basic information, right? So here we have the conquering of other lands where they're conquering their temples. Can you see how the temples kind of looks like it's falling over, right? And then around it are these glyphs. This is all based on a calendar. And so this is called the new fire ceremony. So every 52 years, the sun would rise again and a new realm would happen. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Aztecs. So we'll look at this again quickly when we get to the Aztecs, but I wanted to make sure that we knew that this was made by the Spanish. Okay, the angel and arabesque. This is kind of an interesting image. It won't take us long to get through it because it says a lot in the title. So what's the subject matter? It's an angel, right? What's odd about this angel?
They're holding a gun.
They're holding a gun. What could be the meaning of an angel holding a gun? What could be the meaning? Katie, any idea?
Maybe like to show that the angel's powerful or something. I don't know.
Well, it definitely is a good power image. I concur. I would say that it's not just like the power of the angel, it's like the power of the Catholic Church. So of course, this is in the New World, but this would be dominated by the Spanish, right? Remember that the Spanish were kind of in full force for the Counter-Reformation. And so this is an example of not just any old angel, this is an archangel. right? And those were considered to be like our warrior god, or warrior angels, I should say. This angel is Azrael, which his name means fear God, right? And this image was used to show power, but also to be power over the indigenous people who the Spanish were trying to convert, right? So this image is kind of interesting because after the Council of Trent, angels were not necessarily supposed to be depicted anymore, especially not as someone is armed. But of course, this is in the New World, a little bit farther away from, Spain, and so it was okay. And so this image is supposed to imply the power of the Spanish, right, and the power of the Catholic Church, but it also shows that this angel protects the faithful, right, and that missionaries, people who go to other lands to convert, are in the right, right? So conquering the indigenous people and making them Spanish, right? So an interesting thing about this is this angel is a little androgynous. He's kind of got female characteristics as well as male, and he's wearing some of the kind of over-the-top fabrics and like embroidery, but then also he's got some textiles at the base which were native to the region. So it's kind of got a blending of indigenous and Spanish elements to it. Even his headdress with the feathers was very common for the different groups. They didn't wear crowns. They typically had feathered headdresses. So this was made in South America. So this was made for the Viceroy of Peru, and this is where the Incas were. And so Incas had headdresses made out of feathers, right? Supposedly the Peruvians also had a feathered creature, the god of thunder, and that was a great way to make converts kind of understand what was, to kind of understand the new religion, to make it kind of look like them. So Baroque, what's Baroque about it? The lighting, right? And the use of diagonals, right? Notice how the gun is kind of going off an angle. Okay. This is kind of an interesting object. God, we still have a lot to get. We have 2 more artworks to get through here. I'm going to skip the video so that we can make sure that we get through it. But if you want to, you can watch this video on your own. This is an interesting screen. This is called The Siege of Belgrade and Hunting Scenes. And it is an example of a bialbo, and it also has encanchada. So what is the reason for the cosmopolitan subject matter, influences, and media of this? There's a lot going on, right? So this is influenced by Japanese art. This was something made in Mexico, but it's influenced by Japanese art, right? It has enamel. And so the Spanish were trading around the world. And so they were picking up trinkets and objects. So at the very bottom here, and then at the top, it's got enamel ware that was common from Japan, right? It also has inlaid mother of pearl, and that's what encanchada is. Mother of pearl is from seashells, and that was really common as well. And so on the 2 sides, this would have been made for the Gonzalez family, and this would have been a screen, right? It would have divided a room where the man of the house, the viceroy, would be meeting with people, and then it would have had, the other side would have been the wife's domain, where she would meet with the wives of officials, right? And so we've got different subject matter on both sides, right? So on one side, we have the Battle of Belgrade. Do you think the Battle of Belgrade was on his or her side? Ooh, look, it even says it on the slide. That was on his side, right? Because it would show Habsburg power, right? Because that was a battle that had just happened in history for the Spanish, right? So we have a battle scene. And so all this little glares of light, that's all inlaid shell, by the way, in Conchata, right? On her side, we have much more a tranquil hunting scene. The wife of the Gonzalez was one of the daughters of Montezuma, which was one of the Aztec rulers, the last Aztec rulers. So even these viceroys were marrying the uber elite of the Aztec power to kind of combine those powers together, but it was also a great way of getting the indigenous people to follow, right? So screens were really common of the day. So this really reflects a lot of trade and styles that were common. I would, on my own time, watch that video for a little bit more. The last piece that we have is also in Conchata. This is the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? So this is an example, and I can never even say it, so I'm not even going to say it, but Aripayota, which basically is an object made without hands. The original version of this is in the Cathedral of Mexico City. This is a copy of that. But the original, the one that's in Mexico City, right, in the cathedral, was thought to have been miraculously made. So it was a miracle, right? And so many images of this were emulated and copied. So this is an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. This is the original. Right? So images of the Virgin of Guadalupe are extremely common in Mexico, and they're based on Marian devotion. So remember when we talked during the Gothic, how we have a rise and elevation of Mary, right? Because she becomes, you know, the bearer of life, the giver of Jesus. And so here she's depicted from Revelations. She's often depicted in a full body halo. And then this little image above her is the Holy Spirit. So that's like a little dove. This is a really good example of that Conchata, which is the inlaid mother of pearl. All of this is almost like little mosaics of pieces of shell. So that's the opalescent element of a shell on the interior. And this type of scene of Mary comes from Revelations and Songs of Song. And it's based on the Immaculate Conception imagery. So the woman of the apocalypse, that's what comes from Revelations. The way that she's depicted here is she's clothed with stars, right? She's got these halo kind of coming out from her. She wears a crown with 12 stars above it. She's often standing on a crescent moon. You see that thin little crescent moon at the very bottom, right? And also she has darker skin. So in Revelations, it talks about Mary having darker skin. Now in Mexico and in the New World, that would have been a great way to get indigenous people to convert to Christianity, because they would see themselves in the depiction of Mary with darker skin. Right, so that's the central part. On the four corners of this, we have the reenactment of how that original image was made, right? And the creation of the Cathedral of Mexico City. So there are four sections on the edges. You can see them here, kind of framing that central image of Mary. And it talks about a Nahuatl man. So the natives of Mexico City, there's a man named Don Juan Diego in 1531, and he climbs a hill in Mexico City, which was a former Aztec shrine. And when he gets to there, he actually finds angels. So he sees angels and they lead him to Mary. So he sees a vision of Mary. And so she basically, from, you know, it's like winter or fall, she makes a bunch of flowers bloom. And so there's this miracle. And so that says, you must build a shrine to me on this hillside, which eventually this becomes, I think, the Cathedral of Mexico City. And it's all based on this vision of Mary. And so that's what's been depicted in this scene, or these 4 scenes. So we have the depiction here, and then we have the clergy being told that they need to build the cathedral because he's revealing the flowers that part of the miracle there. So here's that inlaid mother of pearl. There's also paint, right? So it's not all shell. Okay, that is it. So we got through all of it. I feel like I butchered this. So if you want to watch the video on this, you're welcome to stay on. If you're done and you want to leave, you can go ahead and do that too. So try to record your note takers. You probably have quite a few notes to take there, so I apologize for that. It's too bad we can't have our quiz on Monday.
We're standing here in front of a folding screen from Mexico made about 1700.
This is just wild. This is one of the most complicated objects I have ever looked at.
It's actually a really unique object. This folding screen is inspired by Japanese folding screen, and we call it a biombo. And so a biombo actually comes from the Japanese word for folding screen.
But this is a word that would have been used in the Spanish colony that is now Mexico.
Right. At this point in time, Mexico is part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, comprised of parts of the southwestern United States, Mexico, and down through Central America. The Viceroy is actually the administrator for the king.
You have the king in Spain, his colony in the New World, and they're looking to Japan for inspiration.
Exactly. Early in the 17th century, there's this interest in Japanese objects that are coming to Mexico from the Philippines, which is also controlled by Spain at this time.
So why was there trade with the Philippines? What was being traded?
The types of objects being traded included folding screens, lacquerware boxes, ivory goods, and other luxury items.
I'm seeing at the base and at the top black that looks very much like Japanese lacquer.
As these lacquer boxes are coming into Mexico, and there's this kind of craze for Japanese goods or Japanese-inspired goods. And so what we see here is actually a Mexican artist who has created something in the guise of a Japanese lacquerware box. And so the bottom elements have these beautiful Japanese landscape elements, and then you get the decorative floral elements bordering the entirety of the screen.
So this must have been fabulously expensive and the height of what was in vogue at this moment.
Absolutely. And in fact, we know who owned this object. It was the Viceroy himself, Jose Sarmiento de Valladares.
And we know that at that moment, there's tremendous money being generated by these colonies.
At this time, you have huge silver mining industry, raw goods like cochineal, tobacco, various other types of things that are all being sent back to Europe. And so people like the Viceroy are able to acquire these types of goods and put them on display in their homes.
Let's take a look at the screen itself. Most striking, at least from this side, is this battle scene.
Half the battle scene. This biombo is actually only half of the original. The other half is in a museum in Mexico City. We're presented with this really chaotic scene between members of the Habsburg Empire, the Spanish Empire at the time, and the Turks.
So the Habsburgs were the family that ruled Spain and was in control of so much of the New World, but was also in control of Central Europe.
The scene that it's showing is taking place not long before this object is produced. And so this battle is actually very contemporary.
We're seeing the Battle of Belgrade between the Ottoman Turks encroaching into Central Europe. But here we are in Mexico, and this is a Japanese screen. It's just mind-blowing.
Mexico being in the middle of all these networks of exchange, the Trans-Pacific Exchange, objects being traded from Asia, going through Mexico back to Europe, objects being traded from Europe that are then going through Mexico to Asia.
And it really blows apart the way in which we're usually taught history.
Stylistic categories can often break down when you see things that speak to so many different cultures.
So let's look really closely at the styles in this screen. what I'm seeing is not only this delicate, very thin painting, which is almost like drawing, but I'm also seeing these areas that are just brilliantly illuminated, and it's shell.
So this object is truly unique because this is not only a biombo, but this is part of the only known surviving biombo enconchado. Enconchado means shell inlay. So this is a shell encrusted biombo. So it's a combination of oil painting and mother of pearl that's been placed into the screen itself.
I can see it in the helmet, which is making the helmet seem to shine. And it's probably most prominent in floral motifs that are at the very top that frame the battle scene.
You have to imagine when this is placed in a room, how different parts of it would grab your attention because of the flickering candlelight. We don't know exactly who the artist of this biombo was, but what we do know is that it's being made locally. So it's made by an artist in New Spain at the time for the Viceroy, most likely to be placed inside of his new palace in Mexico City.
So who would have seen this? Who was the intended audience?
Each side of the biombo were intended for different audiences. So the side with the battle would have been intended for the Viceroy, people coming to visit the Viceroy, important individuals, people who he's bringing into his reception room, essentially.
So this would have a political use as an expression of his power.
This particular Viceroy has come from Spain to rule over this colony, and so this would assert the dominance of the Habsburg in Mexico.
And globally, since this is also the Habsburgs' victory over the Ottomans, I want to go see the other side. This is completely different. This feels so much more relaxed. It feels much more decorative. And the way that the decorative border hangs, it looks like it's textile.
It's a hunting scene, but it really is showcasing the artist's ability to display for us this beautiful landscape scene. I agree with you that the side looks like this beautiful Asian-inspired tapestry that might be hanging in someone's room, someone of this wealthy status.
We know that the design, at least for the hunting scene, came from a Medici tapestry that was made in France.
The tapestry was then copied into a print, and that's how it appears here in Mexico. And the same thing with the other side, with the battle scene. It was also based off of a print coming from Europe.
I really love this side of the screen. You have, again, a footing which is reminiscent of lacquerware from Japan. But then above that is very dense botanical motif with all of these blossoms, creating this frame that allows us to look into this deep space, into this really spectacular landscape.
The hunting scene that we have, a kind of feast for the eye in terms of landscape elements and beautiful brushwork on display here.
It's almost hard to remember that we're in the New World when we're looking at this side of the screen. The motifs seem so European.
On both sides of the screen, there's actually a lot of classicizing elements. The swags here at the top held in the mouths by lions. This is a very classical element that you see in the Renaissance that's coming from ancient Rome. So this side of the screen was actually intended for a very different audience than the battle scene. The battle scene was intended for the individuals the Viceroy would be receiving, and this actual side of the folding screen would have been largely viewed by women. So imagine this is essentially the room where the Viceroy's wife and perhaps friends, etc., would gather to have hot chocolate, to smoke, which is very common at this time, and to engage in conversation. So an interesting biographical fact about the Viceroy that speaks to this interesting historical moment is that his first wife was actually a descendant from the line of Moctezuma II, who was the Aztec ruler who died during the Battle of Tenochtitlan during the Spanish conquest.
And so what's fascinating then is that that older royal lineage, even though they were conquered, remains important.
You see that throughout the Spanish Americas, where indigenous peoples who can trace their lineage back to rulers are given certain benefits that other indigenous peoples are not. It's complicated and it's hard to know where to situate the objects, but that's also what makes it so exciting and engaging.
Okay, that is it for today. Feel free to ask questions on your way out.